Hi, this is a Retribution guide for raiding for beginners. So who is this aimed for? Well, if you think this is not for PvP, it's not for challenge mode dungeons, it's not for anything other than raiding. So think about the 4 levels of raiding. You've got looking for raid, normal mode, heroic mode, mythic. Who is this for? Well, it might be that your experience of raiding so far has been looking for raids, maybe trying to pug the odd normal, but maybe you haven't performed very well. As Retribution, this could be for you. It might well be that you are already a normal mode raider who gets on to do a few heroics towards the end of a tier, but on another class, and you want to switch to Retribution and be able to maintain the certain standard. Again, this could be a good video for you. What I'm going to cover, I'm going to cover every single ability. I'm just going to go down every single ability we have, every single talent we have, and every single potentially useful glyph we have, and I'm going to go through what all of them do and when you might use each one. So if you're already comfortable with that, this is probably not a good guide for you. I'll then finish off by showing you basic rotations for all of the level 100 talents, Final Verdict, Empowered Seals and Seraphim, as well as show you how to do a good opener, as well as show you a pull on a raid boss, and my thoughts into how I'm using my abilities during that boss. Okay, I am also going to do an intermediate guide, which will follow very shortly afterwards. So if this guide isn't for you, it may be that the intermediate one is more your style. So as I said, what we're going to have a look at is all the abilities that we have as a Retribution Paladin. I'm going to go through each ability bit by bit, apart from the irrelevant ones, but I will point out which ones are irrelevant from a raid setting. So at the top we've got Crusader Strike. This is one of our better holy power generators. If you look at the breakdown of damage, whether it's in logs or whether it's on SCADA or something like that, you might think to yourself, well, actually Judgment, which is the next holy power generator, does more damage. In fact, it even says on this tooltip 4,000 holy damage as opposed to less than 4,000 physical damage. Remember, physical damage is not as good in most circumstances because it is reduced by the armor of whatever you're attacking. But what you need to bear in mind is Crusader Strike has extra damage on top of it caused by your mastery, whereas Judgment does not, and that's extra holy damage. So unless you're packing very little mastery on your gear, which would be incredible and very ill-advised, or unless you're using a really poor quality weapon, it'd have to be extremely poor quality, Crusader Strike will do more damage than Judgment, and therefore is a higher priority than Judgment. Arcane Light talent, don't worry about that. Seal of Command, you only have to scrub around with that at early level, so we don't use that at all at the top level. Judgment, as I've already mentioned. The Holy Power generators, Crusader Strike, Judgment and Exorcism, if we take Hammer of Wrath out for a moment, all have potential functionality as well, we should remember. Crusader Strike, if you have the class trinket, is especially going to be high priority because we need to maintain those stacks with Crusader Strike. Judgment, if you use Long Arm of the Law, which I'll get to when we talk about talents, has some extra functionality there which might improve its standing on the priority list. Hammer of Justice, as a stun, a ranged stun, it does get occasional use in fights, in raid fights even. Occasionally there are adds in a fight that are CCable, they're stunnable, and this is a really good ability for that, so you do need to make sure that you have that handy. In Hellfire Citadel, just off the top of my head, the constructs inside the belly and Gore Fiend, if it looks like they're getting to the centre on very high health, you can stun them and do some more damage to them before they end up going outside. Word of Glory, you are realistically not going to use. It's a total waste of holy power. That doesn't even do that much healing on yourself. You would literally have to be convinced that doing anything else will mean your death to use Word of Glory. Yeah, we're just not going to use that. Templar's Verdict, a holy power finisher. Uses holy power. 3 holy power. It is one of your main damage abilities. Mostly, as I've already mentioned, the idea is to build up holy power and then spend it. This is one of the things you spend it on. Sword of Light is a passive ability. You don't have to do anything with it, but just to point out why we have it. First of all, there was 2 reasons. One is it stops us using a sword and shield. It is entirely possible that if we didn't have this, there might be situations in which you might do more damage with a sword and shield than a two-handed weapon, as incredible as that might sound. So they've put this in to make sure that that certainly can't happen, no matter how they tune the other abilities. The other thing it's for is so that the developers can buff us or nerf us, depending on how our overall damage needs to do. It's a tuning knob, really. So, for example, in a recent buff patch, or buff nerf patch, depending on your class, we had Sword of Light increased by 5% because we were deemed to not be doing quite enough damage. But in terms of how you interact, you don't interact with it at all. Just make sure that you're using a two-handed weapon, and that's all you need to worry about with that. Righteous Fury, unlikely to use as Retribution. There are the odd, very rare situation where you do want to use it to get threat. I remember on Iron Maidens in Blackrock Foundry, I used it when I went up onto the Garan boat, I think, just to make sure I had aggro on the mobs up there. It was the boat you go up to where there's no tank. But in general, don't use this. It's very bad to use this. Redemption, of course, is not in combat use. Flash of Light does a piss amount of healing. It is almost certain to see no action at all. Maybe if you take Selfless Healer, but for reasons I'll go over later, you are unlikely to take Selfless Healer. So you could have it handy. As I say, if you find yourself stuck out somewhere where you can't attack anything and you've got health missing, you could always Flash of Light yourself, or perhaps some other people, just to help out. But that very rarely happens. It should be very rare that you're unable to do damage, and the amount of healing you get off it is crap. It's not going to save anyone. Reckoning, again, there might be the odd situation where you want to taunt. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking potentially Socrathar for the reverberating blows, if you're going to take those instead of a tank, or instead of a group of people. But again, generally, don't bind this to anything that's close to anything that you're likely to use. I've done that before and taunted and wondered why I've died, and that's the reason. Again, unlikely to see much, if any, use as a Retribution Paladin. Lay on Hands is just your last resort. I'm about to die and use it myself, or someone else I am convinced is about to die, use it on them. You do have to be a bit aware. It gives Forbearance. Forbearance is the debuff you get whenever you are the recipient of a Divine Shield, which is our bubble, a Hand of Protection, or a Lay on Hands. So if you use Lay on Hands on someone else, that person is not going to be able to get the other two. So if they're either going to ask for a Hand of Protection as part of the fight, as part of the strategy in the fight, it won't work on them. So you're screwing over the fight there. Similarly, do not use this on a Protection Paladin. If you're one of your tanks is a Paladin, don't use it on them, because you're giving them forbearance, and they may plan to use one of their bubbles or Lay on Hands themselves at some point. So be very careful using this. Mostly you'd use it on yourself in a situation, again, where you're not likely to have to use bubble. Divine Shield is the other thing another thing that gives forbearance. This is your bubble. It should make you immune to all attacks. So it should give you a little bit of invulnerability for 8 seconds. In reality, there are certain abilities that Blizzard say, screw you, you're not being invulnerable to this. But generally speaking, it will just make you invulnerable to all damage for a little amount of time. If you get yourself cornered with a load of shit coming your way, or just something bad, or you're very low on health, and an amount of damage is going to go out into the raid, and you can't do anything about it, and you think it'll kill you, you use this. It doesn't have a really long cooldown if you've got Unbreakable Spirit, but again, that's a talent. We'll go over that later. Mounts, don't need those. Cleanse, keep this handy. There are times when poisons and diseases sometimes go out, and healers won't necessarily be on top of them. Mostly it's for trash, I will say. Mostly this is for trash. I can't think of too many boss fights at the moment where you'd have to use Cleanse yourself, but keep it handy. More mounts. Hammer of the Righteous. Hammer of the Righteous replaces Crusader Strike if in a AoE situation. It shares cooldown, so you can't use Crusader Strike followed by Hammer of the Righteous. Sorry, you use one or the other. Now, you probably need about 4 mobs before it's worth switching to Hammer of the Righteous. It has to be said. It's not a powerful ability at all. You don't use it in a cleave situation. You do need a fair number. I would say as a general rule of thumb, it can depend a little on various things, but as a general rule of thumb, I would suggest you need 4 mobs up before it's worth switching to Hammer of the Righteous. Seal of Truth is your single target or 2 target cleave seal. It puts a stacking dot that stacks up to 5 times, called Censure, onto your ability, as well as does a certain amount of damage itself. It is what you use almost all the time. When you've got 2 targets up, you'd still use this. You can do something called Censure Cleaving, which is more for the intermediate guide. I'll explain more about that, but it's basically switching between them and keeping Censure up on both. Divine Protection is a nice short cooldown magical damage reduction. You can glyph it so that it gives you some magical and physical, but less reduction. Use this liberally. It doesn't have a massive cooldown, and just use it whenever there's a certain amount of damage coming in that it will protect you from. Obviously, if you don't have it glyphed and some physical damage is coming in, don't use it then. It's not going to do anything. Blessing of Kings, never mind that. Seal of Insight, never mind that. Divine Storm is another holy power user. This is used in an AoE situation. The rules vary depending on which level 100 talent you have, but as a general rule of thumb, in most situations, unless you have Final Verdict, you would use this when there are 3 targets or more up. It's not worth using it against 2, except in a special case with Final Verdict, which I'll go over later. Supplication we don't worry about at all for raiding. Rebuke is your interrupt. Make sure you've got that very handy. There will be fights where you need to interrupt, either unilaterally or as part of a rotation. Very important that you have that very close to hand. Hammer of Wrath is another holy power generator. It's only used either in execute range, or when you've got Avenging Wrath up. It does a lot of damage. You need to use this whenever it is available. It is almost your highest priority. The only time you wouldn't use this when it's available is if you already have 5 holy power. Then you would spend some of that 5 holy power, then use Hammer of Wrath very, very quickly. This is why it's usually a good idea when you're about to pop Avenging Wrath that you don't have 5 holy power ready, because what you want to do when you hit Avenging Wrath is use Hammer of Wrath straight away after it, so that you can get as many out as possible. It doesn't have any real functionality about it, but it does a lot of damage. Mounts. Seal of the Righteous. This is what you can use instead of Seal of Truth if there are multiple adds up. Again, general rule of thumb, if there are 3 adds up on a regular basis, then you would use Seal of the Righteous. You don't have to... If you get a situation like on Zul'Harak, for example, now on Zul'Harak you've got... First of all, you've got just the boss up. You would use Seal of Truth there. Then you have an ad come in, and then that's 2. And again, you'd still probably use Seal of Truth. But then you have imps keep spawning in. Now, at that time, Seal of Righteous is probably a good idea. This is one of those situations where, even though those imps might not last a long time, if they're lasting long enough for it to be worth your using Seal of Righteous, just keep your Seal of Righteous up. It doesn't actually matter. It still does reasonable damage against 2 targets if you're going to keep getting more added in. So you don't have to constantly switch between Seal of Righteous and Seal of Truth, because it's wasting global cooldowns, and you'll just waste damage in the end anyway. But this is for your 3 targets or more. Heart of the Crusader doesn't matter. Turn Evil, I haven't used that for ages in a raid. Don't worry about it. Exorcism is the final holy power generator. It is also the weakest in a single target situation. Lowest priority of anything. You use this almost never. You will inevitably get some use out of it. There's always going to be times where you have no other holy power generator on cooldown, and it's not worth you spending your holy power because you don't have 3 or more, in which case of course you use Exorcism. However, when Exorcism becomes good is in an AoE situation. If you have it glyphed, it also does splash damage, so it actually does do a good amount of damage when you've got a lot of mobs in melee range. So that increases its priority, certainly above Judgment, if not necessarily Crusade Shout, because then you would use Hammer of Wrath in that situation. Hammer of Wrath, behave. Hammer of Righteous, sorry, in that situation. Okay. Hand of Protection, just keep handy in case other people need it. Usually it's good for things like clearing debuffs on Gorefiend occasionally. But, you know, you'll see some use, but not massive amounts of use. Hand of Freedom is simply to put on either yourself or someone else if they've got a slow. One fight that comes to mind on that is Iron Reaver. When in the air phase, he lays down that reddish brown stuff and fires. It's napalm, basically, isn't it? Fire's about to erupt from it. If someone gets stuck in that, they'll get a movement speed decrease, and they may not get out of it before the fire comes in. So you could put it on someone there, or put it on yourself if you find yourself in the same situation. Emancipate just removes root type effects. If you get yourself rooted, you can remove that. Very rarely would that be used, but it can be. There might be the odd fight. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I can't think of one at the moment where that's likely to be useful, but it could be. You know, just have it there. Seal of Justice, no. Avenging Wrath is your major DPS cooldown. You do, again, more for the intermediate guide as to exactly when to use this, but you do want to use this, and as I said before, when you use it, you don't want to have 5 holy power. What you ideally want is to have less than 5 holy power, so that as soon as you use this, you can use the Hammer of Wrath immediately, and that way you increase your chances of not having a situation where Avenging Wrath just runs out as you're about to hit Hammer of Wrath and you lost a Hammer of Wrath, and they do a lot of damage. Okay, obviously it goes without saying that when you pop Avenging Wrath, make sure that you can be doing damage for the full duration of it. It's no good popping it and then having to move out for something. That's just heartbreaking. Hand of Sacrifice is a very useful ability for reducing incoming damage on other players, particularly tanks. It is likely to be used for tanks. Sanctuary, don't worry about it. You don't need to interact with that at all. Blessing of Might is again one of your raid buffs. Easy enough. Righteous Vengeance, again, don't worry about that. It's just basically trying to encourage you to load up on mastery. First tier of talents, you've got your speed increases. Now, let's go through them. Pursuit of Justice is the one you're not going to use because it's very unreliable. It gives you a passive amount of speed increase, which is nice, it's fine. And then an extra amount of speed increase for every holy power you have. Well, the thing about that is, up to 3 of course, is you don't try and keep hold of your holy power anyway. So you'll have a very unreliable amount of movement speed, is my issue with this, which can range from anything from 15% to 30%. And when you're trying to judge how much time you need to get from one place to another, because, for example, you want to DPS as long as possible before you have to move out for a particular ability, you don't really know. You can't get attuned with your own speed. So I would steer clear of Pursuit of Justice. The two you really want are Speed of Light and Long Arm of the Law. Speed of Light gives you a very significant speed increase, 70%, not to be sniffed at. For 8 seconds, that will get you almost anywhere you need to be on a raid boss fight. However, it has a 45-second cooldown. Now, on a fight where you will almost never move, but when you do move, you have to move far and fast, then Speed of Light is really good. However, if you may have to move before that 45-second cooldown is over and you have to move fast, then it's not going to be any good. Fell Lord is a really good one to compare the two, because you have to move out, for example, on seeds, and you may have to move out quite far on seeds. Now, Speed of Light would seem ideal for that, because you're not actually moving around very much at any other time, other than potentially to go out and soak. But hopefully you wouldn't have to go much beyond melee range to soak anyway. So Speed of Light would seem ideal. The problem is this: it is possible, although unlikely, but it does happen, that you can get hit for seeds twice in the same round. In which case, Speed of Light will not be off cooldown the second time you get it. And then this is my usual Long Arm of the Law. This is the one I mostly use. 45% speed increase, which is decent, only lasts for 3 seconds. It's a really short burst. You have to use Judgment for it. But again, you don't actually use Judgment as much these days. Crusader Strike is by far the more important holy power generator. And now with the 4-set tier 18 bonus, we use Avenging Wrath more. We've got Hammer of Wrath up more often as well. Judgments are very often available, and the actual cooldown of Judgment is not high anyway, so generally speaking you can rely on Judgment being available when you need to make these short bursts. But it will only get you a short amount of distance away. But if you think about it, like Fell Lord is again another example, when you have to move out for seeds, it should only take you a few seconds anyway, and you have the added advantage of when you've gone out for seeds, you can use it again to get back towards the boss quite quickly. So, you know, the number of times you can use this is dependent entirely on your haste, really. What is your cooldown of Judgment? It's usually between 4 and 4.5 seconds. So you can use this quite a lot if you need to. So this is my usual preference. But as I say, just think to yourself, is it a fight where you have to move out really quickly, but you know you're not going to have to do the same thing again for another 45 seconds, in which case speed of light. But I'm struggling to think of examples of fights where that's the case, because like Fell Lord and Zul'Harak both have situations where you do need to move out really quickly and really fast, but in both cases you could easily have to go back out again before your speed of light is off cooldown. So it's one of those things. But certainly it's between those two that you would choose. The next tier, Fist of Justice, is the one I would suggest taking. Simple reason is you are unlikely to be asked to use Repentance on anything, and if you were, it would be said in advance, and then you can just switch to that. Blinding Light, give me a laugh. I mean, it's ridiculous. It is utterly pointless in a raid situation. Whereas occasionally ads are stunnable, and why wouldn't you want a 30-second cooldown instead of a 1-minute cooldown when that is the situation? As I say, in Gorfiend's Belly is a classic example. Next tier along, Sacred Shield is generally the one to go. In reality, the way Warlords of Draenor turned out, none of them are actually all that awesome. You wouldn't use Eternal Flame, because as I said before, you wouldn't use Word of Glory. It's a waste of holy power. Don't. Sacred Shield, the benefit of this is you will get, you know, when it's like constant little bits of damage, Sacred Shield always does better. The problem is you've got to have Sacred Shield up, and that means using a global. You're obviously not going to do that while you're DPSing, because it's DPS loss. So you need to use Sacred Shield at times where nothing is off cooldown. When you've got a couple of seconds or a second and a half where you can't use anything, then you can use Sacred Shield. Or when you've moved out, let's say on Iskan, you've moved out for Chakram, you can put your Sacred Shield up there, because you're not really doing much damage at that point anyway. Or in anything where you've moved out and you can't do much damage, just, you know, hit your Sacred Shield. Even if it's already active and you're just refreshing it, it's fine. The other one to use is Selfless Healer. I have tried every now and then to use it. The problem is you don't use Judgment enough to stack them up quickly enough to get enough healing from it. And it's certainly not worth trying to do that to put heal on someone else. Again, it takes so long now with the amount of Judgments you use to build up the 3 stacks of Selfless Healer that it's personally, and this is a personal thing, you may find that it's fine and you want to use it, and that's okay. It's not one that I'm saying do not use. You're really bad if you do. But personally, I don't find it that useful. It's better to absorb a little bit of the damage than trying to heal up a piss poor amount of damage when you're not even using Judgment enough to get the stacks up really quickly. You're not going to get massive amounts of healing over the course of a fight from this. Next row, you want to always, where you can, use Unbreakable Spirit. It reduces the cooldown on Divine Shield, it reduces the cooldown on Divine Protection, and you should be using both. You should certainly be using Divine Protection every fight, because there's always going to be some burst of damage that goes out, or almost every fight, that you can use that on, and you should use it liberally. And when it's got a 30-second cooldown, you can afford to use it a fair amount. Divine Shield as well. Okay, it might not help that as much, because unless you're going to use it quite close to the beginning of the fight, even on a 2.5-minute cooldown, it may not be up. And again, fights don't last all that long these days. But for the Divine Protection, it's really worth it. Clemency, this will be required of your raid leader. If the raid leader says you're going to have multiple bops at short notice or multiple sacks, then you're going to have to go Clemency. But this is a raid strategy situation. You wouldn't just go Clemency off your own bat. Why would you? Unbreakable Spirit is by far better. Hand of Purity, it looks decent. You think to yourself, oh, well, this would be good in that situation. In reality, it's not. It's just bad. So I really, unless someone specifically asks you to take it and use it in a particular situation, I wouldn't even bother with that. Ones matter. Your tier 75. Divine Purpose is what we used when we had the tier 17 set bonuses. But once you've no longer got the tier 17 set bonuses, it's really not that. It's not worth it that much. You could make an argument for Hellfire Assault, the first boss in Hellfire Citadel, but on no other fight. And I don't even use it on that fight. But certainly on no other fight would you use it. Sanctified Wrath is the way I go. When you've got extra Avenging Wraths, it makes it last 10 seconds longer, so you've got 30 seconds worth of Avenging Wrath for this extra damage. You've also got a shorter cooldown, Hammer of Wrath, which does a lot of damage. So it's awesome. It's absolutely awesome. Holy Avenger. For fights where you're using Seraphim, in theory, this could be really good because it allows you to build up those stacks more quickly, especially when people are using the legendary rings on the pull, which they're increasingly going to be as more and more people get those rings. And also it allows you to focus maximum amount of damage while the 4-set bonus from your tier 18 tier gear is firing. But I mean, I've tried it a few times. It's not actually as awesome as it sounds in theory, but it is something possible to use in that situation. But here's the thing, I would only use it if you have the 4-set tier 18, and if you're using Seraphim, and if you've got people using legendary rings on the pull. I really can't see any obvious other reason to use it. In general, the benefit of Holy Avenger is allows for burst, and both single target and AoE burst. This is the key thing. So if you have a fight where there's a bit of that, and you want to use it at that point, then great. But in general terms, thinking just in terms of Hellfire Citadel, Sanctified Wrath is going to be the way to go on most, if not all, the bosses. Level 90 talents. Holy Prism is actually a really nice ability in theory. It's nice and flexible. The problem is it's got such a short cooldown, 20-second cooldown, and you do really have to, all of these abilities, well, certainly Holy Prism Execution Sentence, you do really want to use off cooldown. So using that 3 times in a minute is taking away global cooldowns that can be used for other damage dealing abilities to the point where it doesn't really become as useful as you might think. So best steering clear of this one. Again, if it's going to come in useful anywhere, you would think Hellfire Assault, where you use it on a player for maybe a bit of healing on them, but to radiate out the damage to the enemy mobs when they're grouped up. So there's potential for Holy Prism on Hellfire Assault, I would say. I wouldn't suggest using it on any other fight in Hellfire Citadel. Light's Hammer is what you use when you don't have to use this absolutely on cooldown. You can get away with leaving this a bit, but when you do use it, you want at least 2 mobs that are priority mobs to be up for the full duration of it. The full duration of it. So don't use it in a situation where you think the tank's going to kite things around and move it out of your Light's Hammer. That's really bad. Don't use it if most of the time if you use it on a single target during the fight, that's okay, like once. But if you find that you're constantly using it on a single target during the fight, then it's a DPS loss. You wouldn't use it. So fights where this may be useful, obviously Hellfire Assault, you've usually got multiple mobs that this can do damage to. Iskar, if you're finding that the transitions are the key part of the fight, getting all those adds down in time, then Light's Hammer is the way to go. It's of no use. I mean, you would still use it outside of those periods, just on the boss itself, but it's obviously not doing massive amounts of damage at that point. It's still doing decent damage, still use it. But in the transitions, it will shine. Things like that. But in general terms, Zul'Harak, I suppose, is another one. In general terms, for most fights, you are going to want to use the last of these, which is Execution Sentence, which is the one you're mostly going to use out of this. The big single target damage increase. The way to use this, if you have Avenging Wrath available and you're going to use it, is to use this and then immediately hit off Avenging Wrath. Avenging Wrath is not on the global cooldown, so you can do that. But use Execution Sentence and then immediately Avenging Wrath. This is even more important when you have the 4-set tier 18. Because you want the last tick. execution sentence ticks, and it does a certain amount of damage every second for 10 seconds, but it's not the same amount of damage. The first tick does bugger all. The last tick does a lot of damage, So you want to time that to meet with as many of your damage buffs as possible. So that's why it's important you hit this and then immediately Avenging Wrath. If you're going to use Avenging Wrath at all, you won't use Avenging Wrath for every execution sentence, but where you do, time it like that. Okay. Obviously, make sure you use it on something where that last tick is going to hit. Occasionally, you might use it on a target. Let's say Socrathar, I've done this. We use it on a Dominator, but then the Dominator dies within 10 seconds, and the final couple of ticks don't even hit it, and it's largely wasted. In that case, you're actually better off saving it. Just save it, and then use it on the Soul of Socrathar in that case. But do make sure that whatever you use it on is going to still be alive when that final tick hits, otherwise you're losing a lot of damage. The final tier of all is what came with WOD. Empowered Seals I'll start with first because it is the least used. It allows you to get a benefit depending on which seal you are judging in. Forget about Judgment of Insight, you're not going to do that. Judgment of Righteousness, you'll be switching between Righteousness and Truth. It is possible to keep them both up. You will notice that the benefits last for 20 seconds. You will be judging more than once every 20 seconds. So seal switches required. So you can maintain these up for as much as possible. It's a very fiddly one to use. And it doesn't even do, even if you play it perfectly, and it's probably more difficult to play this perfectly than the other two, it doesn't actually do any more damage. So unless you really enjoy this seal swapping style of play, I would steer clear of it. It's not going to do you any damage favours, and it takes a lot of practice to get it right. Seraphim is another fiddly one, but it's not nearly as fiddly. The main issue with this is it takes all 5 of your holy power, and it gives you a 15-second buff that buffs basically your secondary abilities, your haste, critical strike, mastery, multi-strike, and versatility for 15 seconds. So obviously you think to yourself, and it's got a 30-second cooldown, so you ideally want about 50% uptime on it. You won't get actually 50% uptime on it, depends on the length of the fight and various other things. But the key thing to note is this: you want this to line up with other damage dealing abilities. So when you use Avenging Wrath, for example, you want to be able to fire off Seraphim at the same time. Seraphim is also off the global cooldown. So you could use, for example, Execution Sentence, then immediately use Avenging Wrath and Seraphim. You can even macro them together to fire off at the same time. Have a separate Seraphim as well. Don't just macro them together and leave it at that, because you don't want to use Avenging Wrath every time Seraphim is off cooldown. But when you're going to use Seraphim and Avenging Wrath at the same time, you can macro them together. It's useful if you've got... It's certainly if you've got legendary rings in your raid group and you've got the tier 18 set bonuses, you probably want to be using Seraphim on all single target fights, or on all fights where single target priority adds are the way to beat that fight. Final Verdict is the easier to use because it simply replaces your Templar's Verdict, and you would use it in any situation where you would ordinarily use Templar's Verdict. The extra benefit of this one is it allows you to use Divine Storm when there are 2 targets up instead of 3. And the way you do that is to weave. So you use Final Verdict, that gives you a buff. Then the next time you're going to use it, if there are 2 or more adds up, use Divine Storm. Then the next time you use Final Verdict again. What you don't do is just spam Divine Storm no matter how many adds there are. It doesn't matter if there's 10, 15, 20, it doesn't matter. You always use Final Verdict, then Divine Storm, then Final Verdict, then Divine Storm. Okay? There's no situation on which you would just spam Divine Storm if you have Final Verdict. The other benefit of this one is it's got a range on it. You can do it from 10 yards away. So if there's a lot of movement and bosses constantly being pulled out of your range, you can still use that. It's very good for that. But generally on a single target fight, as I say, if you're up to date with your gear and you've got the latest gear, it is probably going to fall a little bit by the wayside compared to Seraphim on single target, but not in an AoE situation. Final Verdict will still be better then. Situations in which Final Verdict could still be used single target, as I say, if there are a lot of legendary rings in your group, maybe then. Or if your weapon, if you've been lucky with weapons and less lucky with other things, if the item level of your weapon is significantly higher than your average item level, then you might still benefit from Final Verdict on single target, because it is the damage from Final Verdict is based very much on your weapon damage, much like Templar's Verdict. Because it's essentially the same as Templar's Verdict, but all the damage is holy power, so holy damage, sorry, so it ignores armor. Seraphim, on the other hand, just buffs your stats, so the quality of your weapon is irrelevant. It just buffs your stats, and you do flat out more damage with it. Just open up the major ones here. Obviously, a lot of these are not even usable by Retribution, so I'll just go through them. Avenging Wrath is a possible one. I can't remember the last time I used it, but it's possible. While Avenging Wrath is active, you are healed for 1% of your maximum health every 4 seconds. It is unlikely to be more useful than others. Certainly, if you're thinking about this, think to yourself, because you wouldn't use Avenging Wrath just because you wanted a bit of healing. You use it as a damage buff. When I'm using Avenging Wrath, do I find that there's a fair amount of damage going out, and would this be useful? So you could think in terms of Gore Fiend during the feast. Well, there's damage going out there. Is it useful? In theory, yes. In practice, of course, there are other glyphs that are more useful on Gore Fiend, so you wouldn't use it on that particular fight. But if you can think of a situation where there's no other useful glyphs to use, and you think you will be taking damage during your Avenging Wrath periods, then you could consider this. You wouldn't take that, you can't take that, you wouldn't take that. This one, again, unlikely to be used, but it could be. Judgment hits, fill your target with down, reduces the movement speed for 2 seconds. So where there's ads that mustn't reach somewhere, so you might think in terms of Kilrog Deadeye, where the ads are moving past on the way to the dais. Would you, in theory, that's an advantage, but it's only going to slow them down for a couple of seconds. Probably what you'll find is that Death Knights have got Chillblains for that fight anyway, so they'll be slowing them down passively anyway. Is it useful? Not really. It's one of those, in theory it can be useful. You can imagine situations where it's useful, but then when you think of the actual fights we've got in Hellfire Citadel at the moment, is it useful in any fight? No. No. Divine Protection, this may. If the major source of damage that is likely to threaten your life is physical, you would glyph Divine Protection. The standard Divine Protection gives you a damage reduction for only magical damage by 40%, which is awesome. But if you're on a fight where the major source of damage that is going to really hurt you is not magical damage but physical damage, then that ability is useless. This allows it to become useful again. It doesn't switch it to physical damage. It means it'll do physical and magical damage, but only by 20%. But that is still decent. But thinking in terms of the fights that there are in Hellfire Citadel, I am going to say I cannot think of a fight where I would glyph it. But thinking, in terms of other tiers, there may be. But in terms of Hellfire Citadel, would I glyph Divine Protection? No. But it is still a useful glyph in theory. Divine Shield, unless you're going to get constantly spammed with debuffs, and the way to get out of those debuffs is to use Divine Shield, and I can't think of a fight in Hellfire Citadel where that's the case. No. No. Divine Storm, potentially. If it's a single target fight, I would take this as one of the three. The reason is, when I get to the ones that are useful in other situations, is you will find it's probably the better of the other glyphs you could use when there isn't any damage increasing glyph to use. It means every time you use Divine Storm, you will get a bit of healing. And you think to yourself, well, how's that useful on a single target? It is because every now and then you will get an Empowered Divine Storm, which can be a single target increase, especially with Final Verdict. If you're using Final Verdict on a single target fight, this glyph is certainly useful because it will see some use. I'm not saying it's going to save your life, but it's better than an empty glyph slot. Double Jeopardy is one of the, actually it's the first probably useful one we come across. This is used where you're effectively doing single target damage, but with frequent ad switches. Gorefiend is a classic case of when you would use this. Kilrog Deadeye is a classic case of when you would use this, because your damage is essentially single target, but you're switching ads quite frequently during the fight. And what this does is when you've used Judgment, it gives you a bit of a buff for about 8 seconds, something like that. And then if you use Judgment again, but on a different target, that Judgment will do about 20% extra damage. It's not awesome, but it is a damage increase. But it is for situations where it's largely single target, but with ads that you are going to switch to. Can't use that. Don't even bother with that. No. Mass Exorcism is for AoE. So as I've said before, Exorcism is your lowest priority spell. It's crap. It's your lowest priority Holy Power Generator, certainly. But that's for single target. When there's an AoE, you can glyph it with this, because what it'll mean is your Exorcism will now only be usable in melee range rather than being a ranged ability. But does 25% of the damage to all enemies within 8 yards. So if you've got a load of ads grouped around you, like on Zul'Harak, for example, with the Imps, or in Hellfire Assault in a lot of situations, or on Iskar during the transitions, then all of a sudden it does a tasty amount of damage. In fact, you will want to use it ahead of Judgment. Okay, so that's a good one to get where there are frequent multiple targets up, not just 2. And that's about it for those. Now in terms of the largely essential ones, there are 2 that I always have. One is Hand of Sacrifice. Hand of Sacrifice is a really useful damage reduction ability to use on another player, particularly a tank. But you wouldn't use it, especially on a tank, unglyphed, because you are taking a load of damage and it will probably kill you. Or it could very well kill you. It will certainly panic the healers. But if you glyph it, it's just used as damage reduction. It's like Vigilance for warriors. Perfect. And you can use that quite a bit. Hand of Sacrifice for Retribution also has the benefit of removing magical debuffs. So you can almost use it as a 1.5 minute cleanse. Although Hellfire Citadel, that doesn't get much use. The other one to always have equipped is Templar's Verdict. What it basically means is whenever you use Templar's Verdict, or Final Verdict if you've got that talent, or Exorcism, you get a 10% damage reduction, which works against everything. So it's just flat out. And you will have this up for most of the time. Even without thinking about it, you will just flat out have this buff available all the time. It's just, you're constantly taking 10% less damage from everything. Always have this, always. And that's it for glyphs. None of the minor glyphs really matter. I can go through the ones you would... The only one you would have... Any self-respecting paladin will always have Righteous Retreat. During Divine Shield, you can invoke your Hearthstone 50% faster. So if you're on the last pull of the night and it's a wipe, and you're not going to pull again, pop your bubble, pop your Hearthstone, you're out of there straight away. No problemo. Other than that, the rest of them are purely cosmetic. Some classes do get potentially useful... and some specs potentially useful mana judgments, like Focus Wrath for protection paladins, but we don't. None of the rest are in any way useful at all, so this is the only one I'd go for, and even that's not useful. It's just, you know, for flavour. Okay, so let's have a look at how this will work in practice. Now, the single target, I've gone for Seraphim here. You'll notice I've got the 4-set bonus. I'll point out some features of that in the intermediate one, though. This is just a general guide for how to use the Holy Power generators and spenders, and then I'll talk about openers as well. So I've got Seraphim, so the first thing I'll want to do is to build that Seraphim up. I've also got Execution Sentence. Okay, but I'm not going to use that just for this bit. I'm just showing the general abilities. So I've got Crusader Strike, Judgment, and Exorcism all around here as my Holy Power generators. So Crusader Strike in the first instance, then Judgment, then Exorcism, then Crusader Strike again, Exorcism because Judgment is off cooldown. Then I can use Seraphim. At this point I'm doing quite a lot of extra damage now, So I want Empowered Divine Storm there. Okay, when I'm getting to 3 Holy Power, unless I've got generators off cooldown, I will use Templar's Verdict. If I've got generators available, I'll keep going though. But what I want to do is to make sure that during periods of Seraphim, if it's just about to run off, that I'm going to use Seraphim again. Very important when you've got Seraphim coming off cooldown that you don't spend your Holy Power when there's only a few seconds to go, because you don't have to be building up when it's available. Okay, you'll notice sometimes I'm using Templar's Verdict when there's 3 Holy Power like there, sometimes when there's 4. That is because, as I say, if I've got 3 and there's a Holy Power generator coming off cooldown, then I'll use it then. Otherwise, I'll use my Templar's Verdict there. And you'll notice I've missed. I've got the Seraphim available, but because I used a Holy Power generator, I didn't have it available, and this would be a big loss of DPS. So when it comes round again, I will just show you how it should work. Okay, 5 Holy Power, so use Templar's Verdict. Holy Power's generator, so I'm not going to use Templar's Verdict just yet, but I'm now going to use it. Okay, and again. But now Seraphim is coming close to being off cooldown. So the key thing is that I get that available, but I don't use anything else, so that I'm ready to use Seraphim as soon as it's off cooldown again. Okay, and while Seraphim is going, I don't actually track Seraphim itself, but I know that when that gets to 15 it can run out. So at this point I know Seraphim's no longer active. I can see it there. Okay, and that's the general way you rotate with that. Okay, so now switch to Final Verdict. It's still a similar thing. I still want to be using Crusader Strike, Judgment and Exorcism, but now I'm using Final Verdict. I don't have to build up anything to use Seraphim. I'm just going to be straight into doing reasonable amounts of damage. As soon as I've got 3 Holy Powers, as long as there's no Holy Power generators available, I'm free to use that Final Verdict. I track a buff down here. You can see this is the Final Verdict buff. If there were multiple things to hit, even as few as 2, and I could sneak onto that one, I could use Divine Storm there and hit both. And that would be a damage increase. But if it's just single target, you're just rotating like this, making sure you use Final Verdict. If you've got 5, if you ever get... Oh, what are we doing? 5 Holy Power. I'm just going to leave this. I'll show you. To get another one. At 5 you would definitely use Final Verdict. You wouldn't use anything else because it's a bit of a waste. Okay, Empowered Divine Storm. If you have the Final Verdict buff, so I've got that. Empowered Divine Storm is a single target increase as well. Okay, it's just cycling along like that. This add-on here, by the way, I'll detail. This is called the Healy. I'll detail that in a future video, which should actually be coming out on roughly the same day, or maybe the day after. I'll link into it in the comment section as well. Okay, so that's how we use Final Verdict. Okay, Empowered Seals. For this one, you want to start off in Truth. You will also want a seal swap macro. I detail this in the add-ons and macros video, which I'll provide a link to, hopefully. So I use that here. This allows me to switch between the two, which I've got bound, of course. Try and keybind where possible. So I'll start off in Truth. Start off with a Judgment rather than a Crusader Strike. Get into Righteousness. Ready to do another Judgment. I'm going to swap back. I want to be in Truth for single target as much as possible. Although don't worry too much about it. It is better to remain in Righteousness for a bit more. If you want as well. Righteousness doesn't do awful damage on single target, it's just not as good as Truth over an extended period of time. You also keep your Censure stacks up is the key thing. You'll notice I didn't actually lose any there by staying in Righteousness for a little while. I'll show you again when it comes round again. So we're just about to switch to Righteousness here. Judgment's coming up, so we're maintaining our... I'm tracking them here. You notice we've still got Censure up there, Switching to Truth. I've not really lost a great deal of damage. And I'm still maintaining the 5 stacks of Censure. Okay. So don't worry too much about it. Obviously it does help if you've got either weak auras or Achille or CLC reps to help you out with that. Some sort of add-on there. But it is fiddly, you'll notice, because you're having to switch your seals quite frequently. So I would only suggest this if you really liked this style of playing. Some people do. Some people do. I don't. So, but that's how you sort of juggle everything around there. Okay, so we're going to have a look here is the opener. I'm going to do this independently of the legendary ring, just to show the general opener. Again, I've got Seraphim for single target. So ideally, as I say, what you want to do is when you go in a boss fight, you'll have a pull timer. You do want to pre-pot just before the timer gets to 0, maybe on about, depends how, if you can trust your raid group not to ninja pull, and you know how good your own latency is, but obviously you want to leave it as late as possible, but you do need to make sure that you do pre-pot. But that pre-pot lasts for 25 seconds, so we don't have to go immediately into execution centers and all the rest of it. So what we're going to do, I'll just try and show you a couple of, I might have to do this a couple of times just to show you everything I want to show you. But the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to get into the truth for a start. Now, as I say, the highest priority in terms of Holy Power Generator is generally Crusader Strike, Judgment, Exorcism. However, I'm not going to use Crusader Strike first of all, because you'll notice I can't be stood here by the boss on most boss fights. And in fact, in Hellfire Citadel, there isn't a single boss fight that I can think of where you can start off a melee range without aggro in it. So you're going to be a bit back. So in actual fact, the best thing to start off with is Judgment. So the first thing I'm going to start with is Judgment. Get into there, Crusader Strike. And then I'm going to keep cycling around because what I want is Seraphim. Now, as soon as Seraphim's available, that, so that I'm doing execution centers, then I'm immediately popping Seraphim and Avenging Wrath, cycling around there. You can see these stacks there. That 10th stack of the 4 set coincided with the last stack of execution sentence for maximum damage. My Avenging Wrath is still going off there, you can see. I've got to my 3 stacks on my class trinket. Absolutely battering the hell out of Hammer of Wrath, so that I don't miss out on any. Okay, and that's how you would do your opener. So on an actual pull, I'm ready with my pre-pot, making sure I get close enough to the boss to hit it quickly. Use the pre-pot about a second before, straight in. The legendary ring's being used here, so I'm using execution sentence followed by Avenging Wrath a bit quicker than I would like. So Seraphim is actually coming a few seconds later once I've got my 5 holy power. But then again, absolutely focused at this point on maximising DPS. Very, very quick decisions have to be made, which is why add-ons like Hakili or using weak auras is a real big help, because you don't want to be staring at action bars or what's off now, what's off now. Any decision making is just going to cost you too much time. While Avenging Wrath is up, we want to be absolutely beasting it. Notice Seraphim there, I was able to fire it off before the global cooldown because Seraphim is not on the global cooldown. As soon as I got 5 holy power, I can fire it off and it doesn't really matter at all what other abilities I'm using at the time. Okay. Outside of Avenging Wrath, you still want to maintain quick DPS. Every second delay is costing you damage, but during Avenging Wrath is just far more costly. Okay, here I've got execution centers available, but I'm not using it just yet. I'm using it now because Seraphim is available. I want Seraphim and Avenging Wrath at the same time where possible, because then it will benefit all the stacks of execution sentence. But it's absolutely crucial you have it available for the final stack, and the execution sentence is fired off first and immediately after Avenging Wrath, so that you can get that final stack of your 4 set bonus affecting the last stack of the last tick, sorry, of execution sentence. Other than that, whenever Seraphim is about to come off cooldown, just make sure, deal with white. Just make sure that you've got your 5 holy power ready and go. Don't go, oh, Seraphim's off cooldown now. Now build up my 5 holy power. Too late. You've lost a load of damage. So that should be enough to get you started. What I would very much do is go through the video, go through your own spell book, make sure you are familiar with your spells. Make sure you've got your spells set out nicely arranged on your action bars so that you can use them quickly and confidently. Make sure you use sensible bindings on them. And then try out the rotations, try out the different talents or whichever talents you prefer. Try out the opener, make sure that you're perfecting the opener, and then when you're able to do a reasonable amount of damage and you're ready for something a bit more advanced, then you could check out my intermediate guide, which should be following very shortly afterwards. Okay, see you later.